To come and join me here this morning. And many of you know, others of you may not know, that this is our 30th year here at Christ Community. We've been in this particular building now for 25 years. And Christ Community started out in Collins Road Theater. You all sit wherever you're comfortable. And so because it's our anniversary, we've been telling our stories. Because what we've discovered is we can go to church with one another for 30 years and still not really know each other, still not really know what God has done in our lives. And so throughout the rest of the summer, you'll be hearing stories and testimonies about people that you've been going to church with, some of you for 30 years, so we can get to know each other a little bit better. So Norm and Gail, thank you for being willing to share your stories. And while we don't, have to hear the birthing story, we do kind of want to start at the beginning, right? Where were you all raised, and what was it like being a kid for you?
Well, I was born.
I think you're on. Yep.
I was born and raised in Central Ohio, and my hometown I claim as Marion, Ohio. And I was raised in a pastor's home. There were 4 children, and we were expected to be in church every Sunday, every youth group, every time the door was open. We were there. We prayed at home, and one of the memories I dearly have of my parents is them kneeling at their beds and praying at bedtime. It was a beautiful, beautiful memory for me and my parents. So it was expected, but that was where my journey started. I went through school, good kid, and all. I was a good little girl.
We're not surprised.
And
right?
the pastor's daughter. Don't ask my brothers, but I was great. And no. So then we actually got into another church, high school, and my youth group was especially important to me. In fact, just 2 months ago, I reacquainted with one of my friends from 50 years ago, being in youth group. Yeah, it was wonderful, beautiful. So then I went on to a small Christian school in West Virginia, and I loved it. I was very involved and loved the idea of a Christian church and a Christian college and all. And I was very active and things, but something just wasn't right. I fell into Great Depression at that time in college. And I really thought, Lord, what do you want? What's the thing to do here? But I just really was depressed. I just couldn't shake it. So then a few months later, I was coming home on Easter Sunday with my roommate and from Ohio, from Central Ohio, and there was a snowstorm, and we were in an accident. And I can still remember it as though it was clear as day 50 years ago that, Lord, if you're ready to take me, I'm ready to come home. And I could see coming towards me, with the light in the background, 3 shapes. And I knew immediately that these shapes were my 2 grandmothers and my aunt. And they said to me, honey, we're not ready for you yet. And when the car landed, without one scratch on it, we had just gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It was all underneath the car. That gave me new hope from then on that God wasn't finished with me at 20 years old. He still had more things that he wanted me to do.
At 20 years old. Did you know those people on Earth?
No, I did not. I had never met them. But I knew immediately that they were my grandmothers and my aunt. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I knew that. Of course, I'd seen pictures, but I'd never met them. No, had never met them.
Life-changing moment. So we're going to stop you there and catch Norm up to that, roughly, that point in his life. Norm, what was it like growing up for you?
Well, I grew up in a small town in northwest Iowa, and like Gail, my participation in church was mandatory. We lived 3 blocks from the church, and I was expected to walk myself those 3 blocks every Sunday morning to Sunday school. And then when the church service began afterwards, I was joined by the rest of the family. And that was it. Thou shalt go to church.
Brothers and sisters?
I have a brother who was almost 10 years older than I was. So he was in that mix when I was a real little kid, but then he was
Moved away.
gone
Sure.
for most of my growing up.
So all through high school until you went to college,
Yep,
you were there without fail because Mom and Dad said.
I was. And when I was in high school, I was part of the choir, and at that time my mother was the organist at the church. And so that was my growing up. In 6th grade, we didn't have confirmation in those days. That wasn't really it hadn't been adopted yet by the Methodist Church. But what we did have was catechism class. And we 6th graders were...
I just heard some moans, Jim. I just heard some moans out there.
We 6th graders were herded into a room with the pastor on a bunch of Saturday mornings, after which we were duly whatevered, and then we were received as members of the church.
So you were raised in the United Methodist Church, but Gail, what was the denomination that...
My father was a pastor in the American Baptist denomination.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I was baptized by immersion in the 4th grade. And my father baptized me on
Nice.
Easter morning, so that was pretty special.
Nice, nice. So we're in high school now.
Mm-hmm.
Then what happened?
Well, then I went off to college, and I went to Iowa State, and when I was there was a Methodist church that was about half a mile from the dorm where I was living. And most Sundays while I was there, I walked the half mile down to the Methodist church. I really, really enjoyed the preaching there. They had a wonderful choir, a magnificent organ. I relished the music that they had there. And wow, this huge church, every Sunday it was filled. It was actually hard to find a seat. And it was a wonderful, wonderful worship experience.
Nice. So Gail's told us that there was a point in her life that things began to change. Was there a point like that for you early in your life?
Well, there was. So after college, I had to take time out for some work with the military, seeing as how this was the Vietnam era. And so I sat out a year and then went back to school in Ames and worked on my master's degree. The job market was pitiful for engineers at that time, so getting more schooling was the right thing to do. And after getting my master's degree, I felt very fortunate to get hired on at the then Collins Radio Company. And I came to live in Marion. I've been in Marion a while, a young whippersnapper engineer. I bought a house after a couple of years, and for those of us who are of a certain age, you would understand this supposed American dream, a 2-car family with a house in the suburbs. That was me. I had 2 cars, and I lived in a house in Marion.
By yourself?
By myself.
At that point?
Just me and my 2 cars.
And your piano.
Yeah, and my piano, yes. About that time, with all that had been going on in the years leading up to that, I'd kind of gotten out of the church habit and wasn't really part of any church here in Marion. And I realized that, I was kind of missing that. So I became involved in a church and became a member and became part of their choir. And I was every Sunday attender. I really liked the experience. There came a time when something was gnawing at me. That, all this stuff had been going on, and I was going to church and all that stuff, but I never really had gotten serious with God. And there were a lot of things going on there, but I was reminded this morning as we recited the Apostles' Creed as part of the baptismal service that we recited the Apostles' Creed most every Sunday in church, and that there's a lot in that. And I remembered back in my college days when I lived in the dorm, there used to be this fellow who would come around through the dorm and knock on doors. I don't know how he picked the doors that he knocked on, but for some reason, my room that I shared with my roommate was one of his favorite targets. And he was from the Campus Crusade for Christ. And my roommate, whenever this guy would knock, would beat a hasty retreat. And there I was, and this guy would talk religion with me. And I don't really remember much of what he said when I think back about it, but he would ask me a whole lot of really challenging questions. Meanwhile, the work was piled high in my desk. There were tests to take. I was carrying a very heavy load of credits. It was like, okay, can we get through this? I got to study. But, I remembered that guy and his challenges to my faith. Now, I never really doubted the existence of God or anything like that. I always knew God was there, and He was there for me. But I never really had a personal relationship. And it got to this crisis point in my life when I knelt down in my bedroom and prayed hard to God. And that was
the beginning, the moment of a change.
It was.
A deepening. Well, I know some of the rest of the story, and I'm paying attention to our time. You do want to talk to them when you have the opportunity about how they met and dated long distance, because it's great. It's great. It's great. Writing letters back and forth to one another. And then marriage. And then Miss Sarah. And then it was time to find, how did you get here?
Well, Sarah was 5 at the time. And we just decided we needed to find maybe a church that had a little bit more meat to it, a little more depth to it. And so we had been called, I don't know, maybe some of the rest of you remember the phone calls that came from Christ Community Church. I see the cones back here. And the funniest thing was they'd always call and ask, are you involved in a church? And we'd say, yes, we are. Okay, thank you very much.
For anybody that doesn't know, this church was started with telemarketing.
Right.
So groups of people would call through the phone book. Do you have a church home? If people said yes, you went, thank you very much, bless you. But if they said no, you would continue the conversation. Well, you had a church home.
We had a church home, but then we started looking. And one Sunday we were led to Linn-Mar High School. The church had already been in existence for 2 years, having met at the movie theater, but it had not been meeting very long at Linn-Mar. And so my parents happened to be visiting, and of course with my parents, my dad and my mom had to go to church, no matter what. So even though they were Baptists, it was okay to go to a Methodist church. And so we walked in Linn-Mar that day, and for those of you who remember Linda Drzezinski, she just open arms and hugs and all of that, and it was just awesome. Well, then we went to the door, and there was a young man there to greet us. And he said, "Hi, I'm Doug Flater." And I said, "Well, nice to meet you. Are you any relationship, do you have to a teacher who teaches kindergarten at Indian Creek?" And he said, "Why, yes, my wife Sue teaches kindergarten at Indian Creek, Sarah's kindergarten teacher." We started making all kinds of contacts with people. We started getting involved with the church. One of the things I remember, and I see again the cones, that we went to a retreat that helped to deepen my faith that was held out at Iadasica. And we just kept growing and growing. And then I got into working on my master's. This church prayed me through my master's every Sunday. Prayer requests. Please pray for me this week. I have a test. Prayed me through. So then when that was over, we were invited to go on the walk to Emmaus. And to me, that was my real life-changing experience. And if you, I'm putting a plug in here, but if you have not been, please go.
Talk to us about it.
Talk to us about it.
We'll help you.
That was a tremendous experience of finding Jesus face to face. It was kind of like maybe that experience I'd had maybe 20 years earlier or so.
So you all grew like crazy.
We grew
then
like crazy.
During a period of time.
And our marriage grew.
Your marriage grew, your family's faith grew, and then God got you by the scruff of the neck. How did that happen?
Well, I too attended the walk to Emmaus. And as with Gail, that was huge. I recommitted my life to Christ at the walk to Emmaus. I really appreciated many experiences we had here at Christ Community that were learning and growing experiences. And along the way there, I was asked to serve on teams with the walk to Emmaus. And on one of those teams on which I served, I found myself strangely fascinated with what the clergy who were working on that walk were doing. Didn't really know what to do with that, but I just found it fascinating. Well, there came a time then when I was still working at the radio factory, and I felt that the situation was such that I really needed to take an early retirement. I'd been there 30 years, but it was time. And after making that decision and starting the paperwork process that would lead to my separation from employment, 3 different people, unbeknownst to each other, made comments to me suggesting that I should be in the ministry. And that was kind of like, wow. Well, then there were some more things that happened. I found myself in the office of the district superintendent one day.
Just found himself there.
Poof!
Signing paperwork to begin what was called the ministry inquiry in the United Methodist Church. And then our daughter, by that time, was getting ready to go to college, and she was really interested in attending Oral Roberts University. So we all took a trip down there, and they had a day down there, a special day for prospective students, and I signed myself up to tour their seminary while I was there. And as part of that, we got to sit in on some classes that were meeting that day. And I found those classes, especially one of them that was dealing with things like cults and so forth, found that to be terribly interesting. I got to do this. Well, it happens, it didn't work out for me to actually go there. For one thing, that seminary is not accredited by the United Methodist Church. But I did sign up to go to the University of Dubuque and commuted up to their seminary 3 days a week for 3 years and came out with my Master of Divinity, and I was appointed to serve a church, which I did for 7 years, and then retired a second time.
And chose to worship here in your retirement, which we are very thankful for. Very thankful for. Well, part of what I wanted Norm and Gail to share with you this morning, both these kids were raised in the church, right? They were raised in families that prayed with them and for them. They were supposed to be in church every Sunday. They were. They got grown up, they got into college, and still there was something missing. Still, God was still doing things to woo them closer, to bring them closer. And different experiences that you had provided that. But just because you're in church every Sunday doesn't mean that you know Jesus Christ. Doesn't mean that you are saved by his grace. Doesn't mean that you have a personal, ongoing relationship with Jesus who died on the cross for you. And, you think, well, they were Christians. They were Christians, and you would have called yourself Christians. But there was more. There still was more. So I thank you for sharing your story this morning, and thank you for being an ongoing part of Christ Community's story. And I want to embarrass you with the fact that we are going through slides and things from the past, and we found lots of them of you guys, and lots of them of many of you from the very early days of Christ Community, and we are blessed that this church came into being. Norm is one of 6 congregation members that have gone on to become pastors, and I don't think God's done with that. I think there are more here, sitting here this morning, that will be called by God to fill their bucket from what God has given them here and go out into the world to share it with others. And so would you thank them for sharing their stories this morning?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.